Today we will speak about Karl Marx. This follows on our little introduction to Hegel. Hegel's thought presented a difficulty for his followers because within his system there are both conservative and liberalizing elements. It's a very tense kind of situation. After the passing of Hegel, a group called the Young Hegelians, or they came to be known as the left Hegelians, were ranged against the old or right Hegelians. The older Hegelians wanted to preserve in Hegel those things that they found to be very conducive towards a celebration of the Prussian state and a celebration of a kind of Protestant Christianity, a bourgeois Lutheranism. The younger Hegelians wanted to critique, dismantle really Christianity, because that was seen as a force that was keeping the revolutionary potential of the situation in Germany from exploding. The reading of Hegel that was conservative maintained the state forms of Lutheran religion, and that was allied to a retrograde kind of political system in Prussia at the time. The young Hegelians wanted to blow the lid off of that. Karl Marx was one of these young Hegelians. He was born in 1818 and he died in 1883. He was born in Prussia, in Trier. He eventually ended up studying at Berlin, but got in trouble with the authorities, so in the end had to move to Paris in 1843. Around this time, he met his longtime partner, Friedrich Engels, without whom he wouldn't have been able to carry on his projects and who provided very important theoretical supplementation for Marx's thought. The two of them, Marx and Engels, in 1848 produced the Communist Manifesto, obviously the most celebrated of the pieces of Marxist literature. That was a very important year because that was the time of another revolution in France. And it was a revolution that started to spill over into the German lands, and the German thinkers were very hopeful that this would cause a renewal of the situation. That didn't pan out in the end. So Marx ended up moving to London in 1849, and there he would die several decades later. He spent a lot of the time actually to produce his great masterwork Das Kapital by reading in the British Museum. So it was very important for him to be there. But also England was ground zero for the Industrial Revolution, which is really the background that one has to keep in mind here. The early times of transitioning to an industrial capitalist economy involved immense human suffering, and that's what Marx is really dealing with. If we want to give him his due, and that's going to be a question for a lot of us. We're going to say, haven't the communist regimes all been discredited? I mean, there's a weird kind of communist regime still in China, obviously affecting a lot of lives, but it's morphed into something different, obviously, from what Marx had envisioned. But at one point, a third of the world was living according to, it seemed, Marxist prescriptions. Isn't that just a period of our history that we want to be done with? Well, of course, one cannot just leap over all of that human suffering, and one has to assess how much there's a link between Leninism, Stalinism, and the precursor in Marx. But Marx does present questions that we're still dealing with. And above all, if we're thinking about the theme of the great conversation this semester, emancipation and ideology, especially that question we've been thinking about with Hegel. What is emancipation? What is freedom? What is liberty? Well, one thing that can get in the way of our being free is the sense of alienation. And I'm not sure that any of us have gotten beyond this personal struggle that we all have to face. That we can feel at times alienated from our society. We can feel alienated from the ideals that we've been given, just handed to us as we were growing up. We can sometimes feel alienated from our own deepest self, perhaps. Alienated from religion, alienated from God. And Fremdung is the German word here. It's to be a foreigner. To be a foreigner in one's home, it would seem. And that's a real question. Do we not feel that existential angst? Well, Marx is trying to deal with this situation of alienation, and he wants to trace alienation back to the economic conditions of the world. That's his way of trying to think through the Hegelian problematic. And we can also think about this situation of emancipation in terms of inequality. Obviously, the communist proposition, which is to destroy private property, to destroy the wage system, to return human beings to a condition in which he had this vision of us as a species being, as human producers, that our vitality is in production, in work, in creating things. And he saw the capitalist system as alienating us from our labor. We have to sell our working power to capitalists, and then the product of our labor gets alienated from us. We don't get the profit from that. It gets taken and put over against us, building up more capital so that the capitalists can then hire more workers and put them into take away self-employment, leave no space for people to carve out their own productive niche in the world. More and more are forced into the wage system. And that's the moral crisis that Marx is trying to deal with. And we think about it in our own lives. I mean, this is something Hegel was trying to deal with in his section on civil society in the philosophy of right. But Hegel was trying to treat it as if this is just part of moral education, that in fact we have to work to eat, and that's just part of being conformed to the universal. We're being drawn out of our little selves. Marx will have none of it. He's saying that we are in the situation where to eat, we have to become alienated from our own deepest creative potential. Marx will have none of that. And I think we can be sympathetic to saying, well, how many of the jobs available to those who have jobs, right? But for those who work in the system of labor and capital that we've got now, for how many are those jobs fulfilling as jobs? Or is that not a good question to ask? But Marx is having us confront these issues. And on top of that, with capital, the profits from the surplus value that is, on Marxist theory, extracted from labor, the augmentation of capital tends to create this very wealthy class that is increasingly causing a situation of increasing inequality, right? Where the capitalists are richer and richer, and those without have less and less. And that question of inequality is a serious one, because how can you have, say, if we're good liberals, that is, we believe in democratic government, is there not a question when we ask, we want political equality, but doesn't that require some kind of social equality? Because in fact, some voices are more equal than others, as it were. These are all the kinds of questions that Marx brings to our attention, because in fact, there was no more trenchant critique of liberalism, and that's not something left and right. On our American political spectrum, everybody really is a liberal if you believe in the protection of rights and the ability for every adult to engage in the political process and actually have a vote. That's all part of liberalism. Now, Marx didn't believe in that system. He believed in the fundamental reality of the economic determinations of our existence. So he called that economic base as being rooted in the forces of production, the material forces, the technological capacities of a certain culture. Those forces generate a certain kind of relation in society, relations of production based on the forces that we've got in that. So economics generates society, and above that base So we have the superstructure now of society, and then law, politics, and culture, which are even more ephemeral, as it were. So the base and superstructure is the way that gets parsed. He has this great quote: "It is not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but their social existence that determines their consciousness." So this is very anti-Hegelian on one level, right? It's the consciousness of men is determined by this deeper relation caused by economics. And that's the difference between Marx and Hegel. Marx is a Hegelian. He's a young Hegelian. He's a left Hegelian. He's a Hegelian. He believes that there is a story of the world, and it's proceeding in an inevitable way. That's the same with Hegel. But for Marx, he wanted to overcome at first, along with the other young Hegelians and Feuerbach, for instance, he wanted to overcome theology. But then he went beyond. Well, he actually followed Feuerbach into also wanting to overcome philosophy. But it was Marx who took the final step to say the real story of the world is in economics. It's in this transformation of the forces of production. As technological progress goes on, these forces change, and therefore they cause a rupture in the relations of production. So society starts to be changed, and then the political revolutions are built on top of this base. So that's a Hegelian story, but it's been inverted. Now what Marx says is, I've got a science of history. The science of history is inevitable economic change. And in the current situation, the capitalist system will so immiserate, is his word, immiserate the worker, that you'll have a class of the urban poor, the working urban proletariat, will become so pushed to the subsistence level, so taken to the limit, that they will have it's not an idea that's going to move them, according to Marx. It's just by the very material extremity of their situation, they're going to have a revolution. And that was his vision. It was inevitable. It was scientific. One might be able to say that with Hegel, the great mistake in both of their systems is one can see that there are patterns of change throughout history, that class warfare is in fact a constant issue in historical change, no question about it. But to say that this is inevitable, that would be the great mistake, it seems to me. And in fact, cause Marx in his own life, instead of making alliances with social democrats or with utopian socialists or anarchic socialists, he said, my vision is the only true vision. And he started in his own life to have that kind of regimentation that would be replicated, unfortunately, in the communist regimes. So we want to think, though, as we come to a conclusion here, of the problems that we still face even if we're in an information age. We've moved into a post-industrial economy in America, but still, do we deal with these issues of alienation of our labor? Do we feel at home, or should we feel at home in the careers we have, in the way we make money, the way we come to feed ourselves? Do we think increasing inequality in our social system matters? Do we think law, politics, and culture are ephemeral, or do they in fact have something very basic to do with our understanding of ourselves and our way of experiencing the world and living in the world? And in the end, do we feel alienated? And is there a good solution for the sense of alienation? Or should we in fact make peace with a kind of sense of not being at home in this world?